Well, welcome in. Happy November, and welcome to the November edition of the Saul Zaentz Charitable Trust's Meeting the Moment webinar. My name is Dan Worry. I will be your host and moderator today for a fantastic conversation around the power of early relationships. If you know anything about my work as an educator, as an author, and certainly in the work that I do in social media, you will know that I am particularly fond of spotlighting the ways that young children not only seek relationship, but really enter the world sort of wired to expect connection and attachment as important prerequisites to learning. I can't think of three better people to have this conversation with today than the panel that we have assembled, who are not only truly eminent experts in their own right, but also longtime friends. So this will be a great opportunity just to be together in fellowship. We are joined today by Isabel Howe, who is the executive director of the Stanford Accelerator for Learning, and also the author of a fantastic new book, which you see over her shoulder. It is titled Love to Learn: The Transformative Power of Care and Connection in Early Education. Isabel, we're just so excited about the book. We're also joined by Dr. Junlei Lee, who is the Saul Zaentz Senior Lecturer in Early Childhood Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and Dr. Suzanne Zedek, who is an honorary fellow at the School of Psychology at the University of Dundee, Scotland. And so we have not only an international audience today, but with Suzanne's participation, our first international panelist participating on the conversation. Suzanne is also the founder of an amazing organization in Scotland called Connected Baby, and we'll talk about the work that they are doing, sort of spreading attachment theory all around Scotland. One quick housekeeping note, as we always mention here, as we get things kicked off later in the hour. We will turn to your questions. Would love to moderate through some of those. If you have a question for the panel, if you would, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the screen. You can see the chat can move very quickly, and so if you put questions in the chat, it is likely that by that point later in the hour we will have lost them. So use the chat to respond, to have conversations with one another as we go, but also then the Q&A function if you'd like me to try to pose some of those questions to the panel. So with that, let's jump right into it. And Isabel, I've been waiting to have this conversation with you for such a long time. I know we've been talking about this book since well before it was a book, and so congratulations on its release and the great success that I know it has had. I am such a fan of the title. And as a reader, one of the things that I just really love, I always love kind of a good play on words. And I think in this case, it's so fitting because it has sort of a dual meaning in this context. Of course, we want children to love learning. But ultimately, the message of the book, in a lot of ways, is about love, sort of as I mentioned, as a prerequisite to learning, right? That's something that is very much a part of the process as well. That we need love, we need attachment, we need social relationships to be able to learn as young children. And so was hoping that maybe you could open us up today by talking a little bit about the book and very much the power of early relationships. How and why are we sort of relational at our core? Oh, and you're still on mute.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you to the Zantz Foundation for the invitation. And such an honor to be with both Susan and Junlei on this discussion and with all of you on the call. So Dan, of course, we want children to love learning. And I would say this is increasingly important in this age of AI, where we have increasing disruption in the area of work that will require constant adaptation and changes for all of us, but certainly our youngest as they mature to adulthood and workplaces. So love of learning is not only important today, it will continue rising in importance. But the central claim of the book, as you pointed out, Dan, and I think of this conversation today, is the importance of love to actually learn. Um, because love is a neurobiological condition for learning. Um, Love and relationships are so central. They drive everything from brain development. So, for example, we have many studies that show either on the negative side an atrophy of the brain when children are not loved and in nurturing relationships, or the opposite, show a greater size of the hippocampus, the front size of the brain, when children are more nurtured. Um, we also know that there is a direct relationship between relationships and love and academic success. So there are studies that have shown a meaningful impact of not only the strength of relationships, but also the number of relationships and the areas of academic motivation and other areas that are really interesting. Um, Relationships are also related to well-being, and well-being is also very closely tied to learning. So one of my favorite studies is from a British researcher named Casper Ademan, who has a very lovely job, maybe one of the best jobs on earth, arguably. He studies baby laughter. And he has shown that if babies are in the mere presence of another baby peer, another little one around them, laughter increases by 8 times, which means that we human beings, it's just one example, there are many research around this, we as human beings are wired to connect and relate to others, and that's a big driver of not only learning, but also well-being. And then lastly, another area that's also cutting edge science, which I find fascinating, and maybe some of the listeners might be interested in this too, is the area of relationships and peak performance, um, where we know that most athletes in the world have, and most people who are at their top of their craft have a coach or some other form of nurturing adult presence in their lives. But we now increasingly understand that the difference between a top athlete, so the one who may win this gold medal on the finish line, and the other athletes often relates to thinking about someone that they love. Anyway, I'm mentioning all of this to say that we now have so much evidence then on love and relationships driving learning, driving brain development, driving well-being, driving peak performance. And then if we wanted one more argument, uh, driving health and longevity. That's also another area that's not as tied to learning, but also really interesting area. Anyway, I will stop there because I've laid out different arguments just to make the case that relationships and love are so critical for our little ones to thrive and succeed in life.
Well, I want to follow up as well and talk to you a little bit about. I don't know if first off on the baby laughter front, I just want to mention I have cited his work many times on social media, and the response consistently is that people say they didn't realize that being an expert on baby laughter was a career choice, and how many people have said that they have chosen incorrectly in their lives, that they would love to specialize in that. I wanted to ask you though, a month ago we on this series Howard Gardner was with us, and we were talking about the multiple intelligences, and I posed a question to him that I almost want to almost identically pose to you, which is about how society is changing, right? And how the our societal circumstances and the rise of more technology, for example, seem to be changing the experience of childhood. I certainly experienced this. If I compared my own sort of social experiences during childhood with those of my own children, that kids are much less likely to be out just sort of playing in the neighborhood, or connecting, even in adolescence, that they may be more likely to be connecting electronically than they are having that face-to-face um, relation. Do you worry? I know I've heard, I listened to an interview you did recently where you were talking about even how the concept of a play date um, is seems to be changing, that they seem to be more structured and less open to kind of truly open-ended play. How do those changes in society bode for our early relational health?
Yeah, then this is an area where I'm profoundly concerned and also want to elevate some hopeful, solutions. But on the concern, there is a lot that has been said and reported, which I think is very, very good, on the adult isolation and rise of loneliness in adults. There is less so on young children, and that's an area of concern of mine, especially following what we all experienced with the global pandemic. Um, Young children are being raised in smaller families. Let's start there. There is a global fertility decline. So as a result, young children have less siblings. They are raised in smaller family units. We also have increasingly on the family side what my colleagues at Stanford Center on Longevity are calling an age-segregated societies, where young little ones and older adults are being raised more and more separately. So that translates into one stat that I quoted in the book, but that I find really concerning, alarming, maybe even. And I had actually to even led me to some self-reflection about my very own family. Um, Only 3% of children in the United States have met an adult above age 65 who is not a family member.
Mm.
So clearly that's, only 3%. So we live in those age-segregated societies where little ones are not meeting older adults that tend to live in other places. Um, but also, children are also experiencing less friendships. So that's well documented both in the US and in other parts of the globe, where, for example, I was looking at a really interesting recent study in Ireland that was done for children, so for teens. This was not for very young children, but anyway, very interesting, on number of children or number of friends that those teenagers have, and showing a 60% decline over the past 10 years for the group that has three or more friends. Um, so essentially a big decline in a number of friendships. And that is related to the decline also that many researchers have documented on the decline of play. And play and number of friends are, of course, related. Actually, some research has documented this too. There's a link between the two. Um, um, so yeah, so smaller families, less connection with adults in or outside of the families, less friends. So our little ones are being increasingly raised in what I call relational deprivation. Um, and we should all be deeply concerned about this and figure out how can we collectively rebuild relational infrastructure for our little ones, for our families to feel better supported, for our educators to spend more relational time, which is where they love what they want to do more.
And you mentioned, Isabel, the relationship between play and that interpersonal ability, the ability to form relationships. What is that connection? Talk to those who may be watching who maybe haven't considered play in that way. How does play help us on the relational front?
Yeah, that will also let my colleagues also, because I know that both Susan and John Lay have studied this very closely. Um, but play is essentially something, is an activity that pretty much all animal species use as by way of developing both social skills and other skills. So, for example, this is through play that we learn how to deal with conflicts, how to imagine new possibilities. This is how we learn how to relate with others and connect socially. Um, and it's a beautiful form of learning because it's a very natural one across animal species and certainly in human. Um, and play, with research from Switzerland on this topic, is correlated with a number of friends. You might say we probably don't need a study on this, but someone has documented that connection where more play drives more friendships for young children.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. Right now, we are experiencing a decline in play, especially outdoors, but generally in play overall. And one of the area that I find really interesting in my area, which I've been observing with my friends and around me in the Bay Area in particular, but I think it's a more general phenomenon, is in the area of play dates. So when I think about play dates, I think about those free play environments for young children. Again, in my area, they have become very structured. So you need, as a parent, to maybe hire an entertainer, buy some activity sets. I mean, it's becoming an entire affair to have a play date. And it's a um, I think it's linked to many other societal trends such as parental expectations and other things. Anyway, it's a broad part of it. It's really really interesting how play, even within play dates, is becoming more and more structured as opposed to letting little ones just free play and with a lot of parental involvement or family involvement.
Well, that seems like a great place, July, to turn to you and your work. I know you have spent decades now focused on caregivers and children. There are so many things I've been looking forward to asking you, but I thought maybe before we jump into those formal questions, I don't know if there was anything that Isabel had to say as she was sort of setting up that that you want to expand upon or react to.
Well, what I wanted to share is about I did read your book. I think to any work like Isabel's work that puts relationship back at the foreground, right, of what is it that we do, with children, both in early care and education, but also in families, in communities, is so welcomed. I think the challenging thing about relationship is that I don't think anyone in early childhood disagrees that relationship's important. But over time, there's so many other quote unquote important messages, right, that gets added to early childhood, both for teachers and for parents, that the relationship just become this thing we say, but it kind of seeps into the background. And so it's really important, that Isabel and Suzanne, like all of us doing the kind of work to put it back into the foreground again, but also make it concrete and something that can emerge out of our daily lives and daily work with children and families.
So that's a great segue then to one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was just this question of how do we foreground it, and in particular I know your work at the Harvard Graduate School of Education is often focused on teachers and classrooms, and so it strikes me that we have come through a period in early childhood where how we assess even the quality of an early childhood setting is changing, and in my estimation for the better, right? That we've spent several decades really looking at what we often call structural indicators of quality, right? Where we look at the size of the furniture and the number of the books and the height of the sinks and teacher qualifications and so on. But that increasingly, I think there is a recognition that maybe the more important thing, or at least an equally important thing, is to be looking at the quality of the relationships and the quality of the interactions that are happening in the classroom. First, would you agree? Is that the preferred way of sort of assessing uh, classroom quality? If you had to give advice to a parent maybe who is looking for a setting for their young child?
I think my my suggestion for parents is the same as my suggestion for policymakers, right? So imagine that you're given two choices. One is you can spend 5 minutes inside a school during a regular school day where the children are doing whatever they are and the caregivers are there, or you can spend 2 hours on a weekend when the school is closed to go count and measure everything that's inside the school. Which choice would you take, right, to get a sense of the quality of that school? And I imagine most people would say, well, ideally, I like to do both. But yes, if I can only choose one, I want to spend the 5 minutes when the children are there. There is something that you don't even have to be a researcher, right? There is something that we as human beings, as Isabella was talking about, there's something that help us understand the quality of relationships, both our own relationship as well as when we observe relationships. And most of our work is focused on helping people to think and talk about quality by doing something that we often ask young children to do when they're out there playing, which is we ask young children to notice, right? To take time to notice, and then to use their own words to describe what is it that they notice. So Dan, you might remember in the past with your effort in pushing for policy change, there was one time a few years ago, we had maybe 3 or 4 governors and lieutenant governors all in the same room. And we were talking about quality. And then the first thing we did is we played a video clip of a child care provider, educator on the floor with several infants. And we just played it continuously, unedited for 3 minutes. And then we ask all these elected leaders the question you ask little children, which is, what is it that you notice, right? And what is so powerful is that what elected leaders see are the kind of things that the educators see, are the kind of things parents see. There's something about us that intuitively help us to understand the quality of the human interactions. Of course, we can develop structured instruments and so on for it. But on the other hand, I think it's hard to talk about quality. It's hard to develop systems and policies that supports quality if we as human beings couldn't notice and describe it as it happens right in front of us.
Well, and I'm so glad I wish maybe I had thought to ask you to bring that video, but let me describe um for people, because I think it's a nice segue to the other thing, or at least one of the other things I wanted to ask you. So this is a wonderful video that Dr. Lee was able to capture in a home-based child care program. It was a child. I'm sorry, I don't recall the gender of the child, but a little boy or a little girl who was a little out of sorts that day. I think the mom had left, and I was feeling some separation anxiety. And it is this wonderful video of a teacher, a caregiver who helped to calm this child, in part through reading them the junk mail that had come in, and started reading. I can't remember, was a credit card offer or some, but it's this lovely video that over a period of minutes, this child goes from very agitated to literally falling asleep in the arms of this caregiver. And what's so magical about this video, again, was it's not some amazing technique that this teacher was trained in. It was a really everyday, mundane sort of, the kinds of interactions that parents and children might have all day, every day. And that's, in particular, Jinlei, something I wanted to ask you about. You've spoken so much and written so much about sort of the simple, everyday interactions. What do those mean, and how do they help us in terms of forming that early relational health?
Right. So I this is an experiment all of us could do, right? So if you Google has an image search, right? You can type in any concept and it'll pull up all the images other people think associates with that concept. So if you type in something like early childhood or early childhood plus parenting and so on, what you ended up seeing is that the stereotypical image we have in our head about a good interaction is a photogenic, spectacular interaction. Essentially, you have these photogenic people with photogenic smiles doing spectacular, playful things. But everyday life for parents, for caregivers all around the world consists primarily of very simple, ordinary, mundane things. With very, very young children, it consists of diaper change and changing clothes and bathing and cleanup and feeding. And with children a little older, for many families, it consists of getting from place A to place B with the child sitting in the back or on the back of bicycles and so on. So over time, what we tried to do was trying to capture the beauty that happens inside the most simple, mundane, ordinary things, and trying to reflect that back, right, to parents, to caregivers, to teachers, so that they feel reassured that they don't have to have spectacular moments after spectacular moments in order to be a good parent and a good teacher, that in fact, these beautiful developmental aspects of human interactions and relationships are embedded in something as simple as a diaper change. And so in our work, we describe kind of these 4 interwoven or braided together dimensions, right? They're not checklists. We have enough checklists in early childhood. They're not a checklist, but they are this idea of, for example, a sense of connection that you just see between people, a sense of reciprocity, right? Not just serve and return, but the meaning of the word reciprocity is to be received, right? The parent being received by the child being received by the parent. And then inclusion, right? This idea that if we have more than one person, that somehow we feel included. Not only inclusion in relation to children with abilities and disabilities, but even inclusion within a family, between parents and grandparents, or in a pediatric office, between the way the pediatrician talks to the mom and the way the pediatrician talks to the father. And so you can think about that. And the last part is, at the core of Isabel's work is learning, or in our work, we call opportunity to grow, right? Like even in diaper change for infants, there's this opportunity to grow that's embedded inside diaper change. And over time, working from childcare to orphanages to schools, what we have seen is that these elements are braided and embedded in the simple and ordinary things people do day in and day out. And we wanted to make sure that people see that in themselves and feel that they are doing enough day in and day out by just being simple and ordinary with children.
And does that relate to the concept? I know you've also written and spoken a good bit about the idea of a good enough relationship. I think it was Winnicott that helped to coin that term, the good enough parent. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think sometimes it feels awkward to ask people about good enough, right? So if you're a parent, you're like, I'm never good enough. Like, I want to be better and better. And I think the kind of societal message we give parents and societal message we even give early education teachers is that you're never enough. Like there's a longer and longer list of things that you ought to do. But I think it is really important, especially for those of us who might be in research, who might be or in positions where we communicate, right, the science and the principles of relationship and early childhood development, to help people find what is enough in their situation and context. So I'll give you just a very kind of a not an unusual example in the global sense, but an unusual example of the way we talk about early childhood. So we work with migrant labor parents who, for economic and social necessity, leave their children behind with grandparents and so on, and they're gone for the absolute majority of the entire year, right? And they get to see their children maybe 2 weeks out of a year. So when you work with parents like that, and globally, there are parents like that all over the world. But when you talk to parents like that, I don't think the message is about how much daily interactions and physical contact that would be enough, because they don't have that enoughness. Right? But on the other hand, they find their own way, right, to maintain that thread of connection with their children, and they place their trust in their own parents to care for the children and so on. So to help these parents understand what enough means within the relational ecosystem around that child, so that that parents doesn't, right, continuously blame themselves and feel guilty that they have to make these sacrifices in order to make a livelihood for their children, for their families.
I want to acknowledge too, Jinlei, I didn't mention it at the top of the hour, but you were good enough to sort of work this conversation in around another obligation this afternoon, and so I know you're going to have to drop off here in just a couple of minutes. So let me ask you one more thing, and take full advantage of your time before you go. You're obviously working within educational settings, and I think you referenced, and or Isabel, or maybe both of you did, the pressures that are being put on teachers now, whether it's to master the science of reading or other sort of curricular obligations, classroom management, and so on. What do we need to do to help teachers to really refocus on this importance of relationship? Is it something that um, we need to be thinking about with institutes of higher ed that are training the teachers? Is it professional development? How do we sort of reclaim a place for relationship in our classrooms?
Certainly. So I think of teachers, right? They are children's helpers. They're right there with children day in and day out. And then I think the rest of us, whether we develop policies and systems and produce research and do training and so on, we are the helpers to the helpers. So then the question is, how do we become the helpers to the helpers, right? And one of the things, this was something that I learned from one of the most important pioneers of early childhood work here in the United States, someone named Fred Rogers, or to children and families, he was known as Mr. Rogers, of the host of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which ran on public television, from the 1950s all the way to the early 2000s. It was the older sibling of Sesame Street public television. So Mr. Rogers used to say that there's one thing we can do as helpers that he thought was more meaningful than anything else. And he said is to learn to be a helpful appreciator. And what that means is that we learn to notice, reflect back to other people. What is it that we appreciate about what is it that they're doing, whether that other person is a parent or a caregiver? Now, I have to confess, after I was trained in my PhD in child development, for a very long time, I thought the role that I play in the field is a helpful critic. Help by pointing out all the things that might have gone wrong. And what I have learned since then, what I've been humbled by the work of the helpers on the ground is that it takes tremendous discipline and commitment to learn to be a helpful appreciator for those who are directly with children, whether they're parents, grandparents, care providers, and teachers. And there's ample research that we can cite about why helpful appreciation is a powerful mechanism to support people who are actually working with children. But I think that thought for me was a very clear kind of transition from even my own training as a researcher.
That's really helpful. I want to remind you that we'll turn to some of your questions in the Q&A here in just a couple of minutes, but I want to turn to Suzanne Zedek, who is joining us from Dundee, Scotland today. And Suzanne, ultimately, a lot of this comes down to healthy beginnings through what we in the field know as secure attachment. Right. And what is so impressive about your work, if people are not familiar with Suzanne's work, definitely encourage you to find her on social media, to look up her website as well. But Suzanne is working, and I want to talk, Suzanne, about how you are sort of taking attachment theory to the streets in Scotland, how you are taking it maybe out of the academic conversations and really working to embed this in communities and with families. But before we talk about how you're embedding it, I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about what it is. What do we mean when we talk about secure attachment?
And I am delighted to be here today with you and with the colleagues who are here today. It is so exciting that we are having these really serious conversations about what young human beings need in order to thrive and be healthy. Because when we get it wrong, and I'm going to start with a word that I don't often use, when we get it wrong, whatever that means, it's not because people intend to do that. Right? It's the way we live, especially in capitalistic societies, is not healthy for human beings, including for young human beings. And in my work with the public over the last 15 years, trying to help people to understand developmental psychology, which is my background, what I have found is that when you try to explain the science to people, when they really get it, when they really understand how relationships are woven into our biology, if the people who understand that can help other people to get it, It doesn't thrill people. It actually scares them.
Mm.
It overwhelms them. It makes them feel guilty and ashamed because they see themselves anew. If they had understood that human beings are so wired for relationships, maybe they would have done something different with their own children or with the children that they taught. And I don't think we think enough about how the science feels in contrast with what the content of the scientific information is. And so I think we need to do both. And so in my work now, I pay even more attention to how the science feels than to the scientific information that I am communicating, so that I can help people to feel good about themselves, to feel good about what they knew at the time, to feel good about the choices that they made, even unconsciously. And if I can help to really to contain any anxiety that they may feel on learning that, and contain is another of Winnicott's ideas that he worked with a lot. If I can help them in managing their big feelings about what they are learning, I can help them to stay engaged with learning more of that information. Right. And so it's very easy to shut down because you start to worry that you are not enough, to use your phrase, Junli, that I was not enough and that I have damaged my children. Okay, so one of the edgy bits is it's true. We have probably had impacts on our children's development that wasn't always good for them. How do we see that whilst not closing down in shame and guilt, so that we can think about what do we need to do to change? And I guess I started there, Dan, in response to your question, because I think in our enthusiasm to communicate the science, and the science is so exciting, it's so fascinating. Isabella, you used that phrase several times. It's so fascinating. It is. I love it. I love that it is reaching the public. But the scientists amongst us, or the early years specialists amongst us, can get so excited about the details that we haven't thought about how it feels when it lands. And so I hope that bringing in how it feels is one more element in this conversation. And so, Dan, let me say one more thing, and then you can come back and ask me more questions if I come back to the question that you asked. The phrase I use more than any other in all of my work is, babies are born already connected to other people. And I don't think most people know that. And from that comes everything else, all the importance of relationships and of connection and of love. All of that comes from this understanding that babies are born noticing the faces of other people and the tones in people's voices. They've been doing that since they were in the womb, and they make meaning of it. So they notice us much more than most adults have any idea that babies are able to notice us. That's why it feels so wondrous. If you stick your tongue out at a baby and a baby sticks their tongue back out at you, if I show a video of that in my own training, people melt. Right? And you think, why is that so touching? And it's because the adults learned that they mean something to the babies. And it hadn't really occurred to lots of people. In fact, cultures teach babies don't notice that. Babies are not responsible. In Britain, we have the phrase, that's just wind. And so cultures teach you that what babies are doing is not really meaningful. And what all of this work that we are talking about now is trying to do is to say, that's not true. What babies are doing is really meaningful. And the responses we give them are being built into their very biology, their brains and their bodies, which is really exciting and kind of overwhelming.
I love it. I had the good fortune to spend some time with you in Scotland earlier in the year and to actually see this in action. Do you want to talk about what does this look like? You've just described this sort of desire, and I think it frames everything that I love about your work so nicely, because it's, I think you've described nicely, I know had a thriving career in academia before you sort of pivoted more toward, let's get this out of the academic space and more into people's living rooms, right? And so how are you pulling that off in Scotland? I know a little bit about it, but I want to let you talk about it.
Dan, that's a delight to have you ask that question. I am by training a developmental psychologist. And in fact, can I just give a shout out to my supervisor, who was named Larry Fenson, who, when I began doing my academic training as a student in my undergraduate work, helped to infuse in me an absolute fascination with children's development. And I retain that fascination to this day. So I took the fascination that he gave me, and then I went on to an academic career. And I came to understand over my 20 years in academia that the things that scientists knew about babies brain development, about how important relationships are, about how they notice us, was not reaching the general public. And it became a moral dilemma for me. What were we doing all that science for, which was mattered and was important and fascinating, if it couldn't reach the people who spent time with babies? And then the people who spent time with the adults that the babies grew into. So that's people like prison officers, teachers, and care staff in homes caring for people with dementia, right? So when we say babies or young children, very often people think we're just talking about that stage of human development, when really what we're trying to talk about is how those early years set up your long-term development. So I find that increasingly I replace my language of babies and children with human beings, because I'm trying to help people to make that link. Okay, so with that in mind, here in Scotland, there's a big movement around trauma-informed practice, or around adverse childhood experiences. In fact, we have been marking 20 years of Scotland's ACEs journey. Across this whole year, 2025 is 20 years of that journey. And so we have been marking that through things like a podcast series, and we've had events, and we've got videos about the work we've done. I can put more of that in the chat if people like, so that you can see how we have translated what is the science, what I call the science of connection, which is also attachment and relational health and intersubjectivity. I use the word connection so that people don't feel overwhelmed by the language or scared by the language, and just help them to see it in everyday life. So when you were with us, Dan, that was a delight. We worked with an organization here called Anam Alba. And I think you were entertained. We were blowing bubbles in this room with you, and we were playing with scarves, because Anam Alba uses creative approaches, uses really creative arts in order to give us new entryways into the science. So what we have done is work with lots of other organizations who are not scientists to find creative ways to help other people to get this information. And maybe that's another insight that people could take, is this movement is not just about disseminating information, as important as the information is. It's about finding new ways for people to get what that means. And maybe sometimes the scientists amongst us stay focused on scientific information rather than linking with other kinds of organizations. But we have schools, prison officers, police officers, social workers, manufacturers of strollers, musicians, primary, secondary teachers. All of those people are part of this conversation about the importance of relationships.
Let me ask you both. We're nearing the top of the hour. I knew this was going to be one of those one of those talks that I wish we had 3 hours instead of one. You know, I am so sensitive though, to Suzanne's point around, particularly some of this attachment conversation can cause really big feelings for parents, right? That they, even to the, what we were talking about with Junlei earlier about sort of the, Winnicott's concept of a good enough
Yeah.
a parent. The parents. Um, I am a believer are always sort of doing the best they can under their, under what may be unique circumstances for them, and we never want the science to, create a sense of guilt. At the same time, though, I think it is important for us to call out that there are big societal questions here and big policy level questions here. That, for example, and Isabel, maybe you and I can talk a little bit about sort of what this looks like right now in the U.S. And then Suzanne, I'd love to hear your perspective on how the UK is looking at this question. But Isabel, I when I was over in the UK earlier in the year, I shared this figure that I wrote about in my own book, which is that at precisely the time that young children, newborn babies in their earliest weeks and months of life, most need stable, nurturing relationships with their most beloved caregivers.
Yep.
That the practical reality, the political reality in this country is that right now 1 in 4 American mothers has to return to work within 2 weeks of giving birth, and that to compound that we know that because of the crisis that we face in the early childhood field, particularly as related to compensation of the workforce, that we have a workforce that is turning over. Our infant toddler teachers are, we've seen estimates that they turn over as much as 40% in a year. And so, again, at precisely that time that we most need stable, nurturing relationships, for many children, it feels that we are giving them kind of a revolving door um, of adults rather than that stability that maybe they crave in terms of creating those early relationships. What do we need to do at the policy level, um, to help elected leaders, for example, understand, whether it's paid parental leave or what have you?
Yeah, Dan, that's a really big question, and one where, as Susan said so eloquently, we all know that relationships matter. Scientists have demonstrated the science of connections or science of relationships for a long time. In practice, we take it for granted. We do
Yes.
not center our policies or practice around it. So it's something very intuitive that all of us know and scientists have demonstrated, but we are not centering. And so there is a broader question around what would a relationship-centered set of policies look like, or what I call a new relational infrastructure for our children, for our families, for our educators, if there were some questions, for home visitors, for all these amazing people who surround our little ones to thrive and be in community. That starts in my mind, as you pointed out, Dan, with family. So family leave would be on the top
Yeah.
of my list in the US. The US is the anomaly in the world in terms of developed nation not having a family leave policy nationwide. So there are a few states that have one in place, and there is one for federal employees, but it doesn't extend to a federal policy, or to a national policy. So many states do not have that in place, which results in this 1 in 4 parent not having to return to work after 2 weeks after their child being born, or the other stat that I had in mind is 80% of workers in the US do not have access to a family leave policy. The other one that you mentioned is, early educators. So how can we have more policies that encourage and foster relationships for early educators? And to me, it's a lot about time and ensuring that educators also spend time doing what they love, which is a relational piece, as opposed to a lot of administrative tasks that we know exist and will continue existing, but how can we reduce those to the minimum so that educators can spend more time on relationships and doing what they really enjoy doing? And then there's another policy that I would love to also see expand, which is intergenerational policies. So there are some programs that exist that are funded, some in part by philanthropy, but some also by government pools in early elementary grades that bring older adults in classrooms to support and be another loving presence for young children. I would love to see those programs being expanded in the early years. This requires obviously funding, organization, and otherwise, but that's also another policy that I would love to see. More focus on this intergenerational ideas, which has been part of our human development, our human being development, as Susan calls it. And we have lost ground in our modern societies on that concept. So how can we revive it in a modern way in our modern age groups? And policy intervention might be helpful there.
Yeah, Dan, can I come in contrast with the really helpful figures that you've just provided, Isabella?
Sure.
Here in Scotland, our maternity leave policy, and you could think of that as family leave, but it's called maternity leave. Maternity leave is for 52 weeks. Okay, now that isn't at full pay, and there's a graded pay structure. And for some families, the pay that is available is not enough to support them. And so it's very common for children to go into nursery care at 9 months. But if you said children going into nursery care at 4 weeks, there will be an intake of breath. There will be a shock. Did you see my face when Isabella, you said play dates are structured? And I went like this. Okay, that's what will happen if you say putting children into nursery at 2 weeks or 4 weeks. That will cause shock in Scotland. So people kind of take for granted that those maternity leave policies of up to about a year exist everywhere else too. And so when I say, no, they don't exist in America, that is a shock to people. And I think it is a shock to people in America to hear that there is a government policy that says you have 52 weeks of maternity care. And in fact, you also have effectively federal paternity care. Now, that's been a big fight to embed that in policy. But in other words, it is possible. Right? So if I add one more thing, the fact that that is not in American policy is a choice. It's a choice on the part of policymakers and politicians. They may not quite know they made that choice, but if other places have made a choice to have family leave and to have different financial packages, it's possible for the US to do that as well. So when I talk to policymakers, I say really calmly to them that if they have policies that do not support relational health, they are harming children. And then I pause so that we can hear the word harming, and that can settle, because people do not intend to harm. That doesn't mean that we are not harming. And so people in power need to take responsibility for the harm that they cause by the infrastructure they set up. And we need to step into that responsibility. It's no longer from lack of knowing. It's due to something else. It's due to values, or it's due to lack of curiosity, or it's due to overwhelm, right? We need to sort that out, because we are harming our own children and our own culture. And that will cost us lots of money down the line in prisons and divorce rates and lack of educational outcomes. So it's dumb. It's not only harming, it's dumb. And we should stop it.
Yeah, this is one of the central themes of my own book here, is this question of at what cost, right? That,
Yes.
is it, is it important at some level to encourage adult employment? Yes, but the ways that we do that in this country at this point may ultimately, to Suzanne's point, be saddling taxpayers in the long term with much more expensive costs than the provision of more robust maternity leave could ever begin
Yeah.
to describe, right? In terms of the mental health outcomes and the long-term health outcomes, and a whole litany of topics here that we will have a bearing on the long-term costs to taxpayers and society. We have gone, well, at this point, a couple minutes over our promised hour. I hate to wrap us up, but I will, but just by saying what a treat it is. I knew this one would fly by. Isabel Howe, Suzanne Zedek, Junlei Lee, who had to jump a few minutes ago. What a treat to see all of you, to have this conversation, and maybe we need a part two. Like I see, even someone in the chat is suggesting that. So maybe this is a conversation that we can continue having here. Isabel and Suzanne, thank you for taking time out. And Isabel, again, hold up your book. It can't be so small. And the love to learn. Please, I definitely recommend that you check it out. I know it's available on Amazon and elsewhere. We will be back. Let me, just as a sort of a programming note to all, please know we are going to take the month of December off. We have decided that between Thanksgiving and the winter holidays, people are so busy that it may just be a challenge in terms of viewership. But we are planning something that I think will be really special for January, which is sort of an unpacking of the current conversation on health care and health insurance in this country. And we will have an amazing panel coming together in January to help us to do that. So look forward to sharing the details of that. We will, in this case, wish you not only a happy Thanksgiving, but happy winter holidays as you may celebrate them. And we will see you back here in January. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.